Good evening and welcome to a virtual discussion on the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act. My name is Whitney Tawney and I am the Executive Director of the Montana Conservation Voters Education Fund. And I'm delighted to be here to moderate this panel this evening. But before we dive in, I just want to let everyone know we are recording this event and taking questions via the audience. So please submit your questions via the Zoom function or via Facebook live stream on our MCV Education Fund page, and we'll be sure to answer your questions later on in the program. All right, now to introduce our fantastic panel. First, we have State Senator Shane Morigeau from Senate District 48, which includes much of northwestern Missoula. Shane previously served in the Montana House of Representatives for District 95 from 2017 to 2021. He's a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes and grew up exploring the Mission Valley outside of Ronan. Shane earned both his undergraduate and law degrees at the University of Montana and is a 100% lifetime champion of our sister organization, Montana Conservation Voters. Next, I want to introduce Amy Caseyo, an inaugural board member of Mountain Mamas, a network of women across the Rocky Mountain West who advocate for climate, clean air, and water and public lands. She is the founder of Studio Verde Creative, a client-centric creative agency in Missoula. She holds multiple positions on Montana statewide initiatives that further women's self-reliance, health, and community leadership. And last but not least, I want to introduce Todd Frank, the owner of the Trailhead, an outdoor specialty gear store in Missoula. Todd is also a board member of the Grassroots Outdoor Alliance, a group of 100 specialty outdoor retailers who work together to better the entire outdoor business community. He has also just come back from Chile, and we're so grateful that he is joining us this evening. So thank you all for being this discussion and this important issue. And a quick high-level overview of Bcsa for folks with the federal legislation. Apologies. This legislation has been in the works for some time and stems from decades of collaborative efforts between ranchers, timber mill workers, outfitters, conservationists, mountain bikers, business owners, and others with the goal to protect the Blackfoot River permanently and by protecting its most important tributaries. The latest poll of the University of Montana found that over 75% of Montanans support the bill, including many of you here tonight. So thank you. The bill is made up of three large components. One, the first, timber and restoration, which creates a sustainable timber economy through forest and wildlife habitat, forest restoration activities. Two, recreation, which opens up 2,000 more acres that are currently closed to land for snowmobiling and protects 3,800 acres for mountain biking and hiking. And three, conservation, permanently protecting the Blackfoot watershed by adding nearly 80,000 acres to the Bob Marshall, Scapegoat, and Mission Mountain wilderness areas, all ensuring that there is high quality wildlife habitat, clean water, and recreational opportunities for the future. Senator Jon Tester first introduced the bill in the US Senate in 2017, and last fall, this bill had its first hearing in the US Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee. Unfortunately, during the hearing, our junior Senator Steve Daines announced that he was only going to move the bill forward if it was paired with legislation to strip wilderness study areas of their protection, which would likely result in the loss of protection for hundreds of thousands of acres of public lands here across the state. As you can expect, this is a giant blow to the Montanans who spent their careers working to protect the land, and folks like us here who want to protect Montana's beautiful landscapes and wild habitats. So that brings us to today. Let's learn a little bit more about the bill and ways we can help get it across the finish line. So let's dive right in, and we'll start with some panelist questions here. So first, Shane, before we get much deeper into the current status of the bill, can you talk a little bit about the history of the region and what it means to Montanans?
Yeah, so first I just want to say that thank you to MCV and all our partners and all our great work to protect the watersheds and protect these wilderness areas. And also, one of the big things that I think is really important is protecting bull trout habitat within the wilderness areas in our tributaries. I think this is a big deal, and I think it's a great way to strike a balance on diverse stakeholders across the state of Montana. I want to say that I'm here as a senator for Senate District 48. I'm not here on behalf of the Salish and Kootenai tribes. There's always folks out there that might differ in their opinions than me, but for me, this is a great this is a great thing, and it's a big deal for Montana, especially as we try to balance diverse stakeholders and growth throughout the state. This assures that we have lands that need to be protected, are in fact protected. And for me as a Salish and Kootenai person, it's protecting wildlife habitat that's been there for thousands of years, that's been important to the Salish and Kootenai people, for our homelands, our Aboriginal territories, for hunting and gathering. It was travel corridors for the CSKT. You can go back to an unfortunate time in our history with the Swan Valley massacre in 1908, where Pend Oreille members were out hunting there at the time, and continuing our long tradition of hunting and gathering in the area when they were unfortunately met with pushback and blowback by individuals at the time, and the result of people being lives being lost. And so, for us, this is a continued effort for me and a lot of people, a continued effort to protect that important area for wildlife habitat, to ensure that we have this habitat in this area forever. And one of the things that the bill actually does is it ensures that our treaty rights, in fact, stay intact for protection of tribal treaty rights under Section 401 of the bill. So continues that long tradition for us and ensures that our treaty rights are recognized through the legislation.
Awesome. That's great. Amy, how specifically will the passage of this bill increase economic development in the region, and how will conservation efforts help with improving quality of life?
Yeah, you bet. Shane, thanks so much for sharing that deep meaning of place and that this means to so many people. We really appreciate that. In terms of economic development, this is a solution that we can all be proud of and one that we can all benefit. So in terms of numbers, in 2017, $7.1 billion was generated by the outdoor recreation industry. I'm just going to say that again for emphasis, because that's a lot of money, of $7.1 billion. That's just in the outdoor recreation economy. And then this generated $286 million by state and local tax monies. It was 71,000 jobs in 2017 and was rapidly growing as the fastest growing sector in Montana, along with tourism. Now we've had a bump with, or a dip with the pandemic. However, what we're seeing actually in these times in terms of quality of life, while the dollars have taken a bit of a hit, there are people who have initially moved away from Montana and have been trying to get back here because of the unparalleled quality of life. And now with the viability of remote work, which is one of the upsides of these wild times, many are finally returning back to Montana, which is a dream come true. And some are moving here for the first time. So we have seen, really unprecedented growth and a bunch of communities across Montana. And with this comes people who are either relocating their businesses and taking them with them. They're starting new businesses. And then this all leads to a lot of ancillary ripple effects for economic development. It makes our economy more resilient. and it diversifies it. It puts us in a better position for the challenges, both known and unknown. So it's pretty amazing to see that the healthier our public lands and waters are, the more valuable they are. And then the direct industries that are seeing the impacts of this are, looking at hunting, angling, snowmobiling, mountain biking, hiking, skiers, ATVers, who then spend their money on gear, outfitters, lodging, food, gas, and entertainment. So this is definitely one of those situations and those an opportunity where so many people benefit, as well as wildlife and fish.
Absolutely. I think that noting the pandemic, especially these last 2 years have been really hard for everybody, and the mental health piece has particularly been important to be able to get outside. So Todd, how do you see Bcsday directly impacting your business, the trailhead?
Well, I think a lot of it, and thanks, Amy, for being so articulate and laying that all out. A lot of it is sort of the same thing that she talked about. I think directly for us, what we've seen is there's really kind of three things. And one is that we're getting new people moving to the area because we have these resources at our back door, and they can do it now. They can work remotely. They can, go to work in the morning, go for a mountain bike ride in the afternoon, that sort of thing. And that's made Missoula be a place that people really, really want to be. And, we've seen those consumers coming into the store saying, we want to go hiking, we want to get on the river, we want to do all these things, can you help us out? And so we've seen the growth from those people. But in addition, we've also seen, that returning people who grew up here, left, they came back, they're now maybe coming back and helping take over a business. And just, it's a perfect opportunity for maybe the husband still has to work remotely. So, I'm getting to see familiar faces from 25 years ago, people that I worked with that are moving back and are very excited about it. But I think the bigger one for us, is that our local consumer base, which has been incredibly loyal to our business for a very, very long time, a lot of those people used to spend a lot of time traveling. And when the pandemic hit, they all kind of went, well, wait a minute, we can't do that anymore. What can we do locally that is pandemic proof or safe or whatever, however you want to describe it. And so we saw a ton of people that were wanting to get out backcountry skiing, wanting to get out cross-country skiing, wanting to get on the river over the course of the last, full 2 years at this point. And it's been really interesting to see families starting new activities that are related to being out on public lands and out, doing recreational activities that maybe they would have gone to Disneyland or somewhere else in years past, and they're just not doing those kind of things now. Mm-hmm. And so for us, it's, while the pandemic, was very, very painful for a period of time, we really bounced back fairly quickly and saw a lot of folks that came to Missoula. And I think the reason that they're coming here is because of the activities, because of the access that we have to the public lands. And, this has not been a new fight. I mean, this has been something we've been talking about, the Blackfoot, I know I've been involved at least peripherally for the last 8 or 10 years. And so it's, we keep talking about the same thing. And now I think for a lot of people locally, their eyes have really been open to, this is such an amazing place. And, I think for me, that's been the main economic benefit.
Awesome. Yeah, I will reemphasize the fact that 75% of Montanans across the whole state really support this. So that's awesome. Now, kind of a question for everybody. How will this impact the lives of the people who live in the Blackfoot Valley? I don't know, who wants to start?
I would just say that I have a couple of friends that live in the Seeley Lake area, and they're seeing increased use. They're seeing increased activity in their places of business. The restaurants and stores that they operate there, and that's that's not going to go away. And so I think they probably on one side are excited about more activity, but are also want to make sure that it gets managed properly and that there's places for people to park when they come to town and places for people to eat and that sort of thing. But they're both very excited about it. They think that it's a great thing for their community. It's sort of in a 12-month cycle. There's things happening all the time now, where Sealy Lake used to be like 2 months of the winter and 3 months of the summer, and that was kind of it. And the rest of the year it was pretty quiet. So that's my personal perspective.
Yeah, I can talk. I don't live in that particular area. I grew up being dropped off, in helicopters into the Bob Marshall for firefighting. I've spent a lot of time in the area, actually recreating. I don't live there, so I can't speak for folks who actually live there. And but I know that as somebody who grew up in the area, who grew up hunting over in the Mission Mountains quite often and coming over to the other side, to me it's a huge opportunity to protect wildlife habitat, especially as we talk about elk habitat. And I think people, of course, as we look at how Montana is growing, we've talked about this a little bit already, growth in Montana as areas become sought after, and you hear stories about how developers are already looking to different areas throughout the state of Montana to develop. I feel that, I feel as somebody who has treaty rights in the area, that I have some assurances in knowing that that area is going to be protected, that the wildlife and resources are going to be protected from development in those areas, and that we're trying to find a way to bring, and we are finding a way. Thank you, Senator Tester, for approaching the world this way by bringing diverse stakeholders to the table to work through these issues, to where we are striking a balance to protect the area and balance those issues. So, as we see our economy in Montana, this over $7 billion industry in Montana, number one industry now is outdoor recreation. We're going to continue to see those pressures. So it's a win in protecting those areas, but also ensuring that the local community is protected from those growth pressures, and at the same time bringing in much needed resources for recreation that goes right into the pockets of local business.
100%. So Amy, can you talk a little bit about how Bcsa is really tied directly with kind of this Montana way of life and Montana values?
Oh, definitely. As Montanans, we share this deep love of place. And that is one of those core values that really bring us together. And in a time when there are many things that threaten to divide us, this is one of those things that really unites us, is that we value very highly the access to and the health of public lands and waters. So these are often serving as the setting of some of our most favorite memories, and whether it's, floating on the Blackfoot, and depending on what kind of craft you're in, some of them are questionable or may not be as flotation safe as others, but looking at camping with family and friends on the shores, or filling freezers with meat in the fall. These are parts values that we share and we hold, and we're willing to do the hard work of standing together and coming together. And as Shane mentioned, the diverse stakeholders, that's one of the things that really stands out to me in this bill, and not only the bill, but the process to get here, of this working group that has worked for decades on this, and ensuring that there are all these voices at the table. And that's how you get to a 75% approval rate, is by the diversity of voices, and crafting a solution that is really inclusive and benefits all. So, as citizens of the state, we share a really rich history in coming together for common goals around our common lands and waters. And, we've seen before with the creation of the Blackfoot Challenge and the Big Hole Watershed Committee Group, that we can come together even with super diverse interests for the sake of these shared values. And with this bill, we have a position to do it again, and actually lead in the national space.
Awesome. And Shane, I would love it too if you could talk a little bit more about how tribal nations like CSKT have been involved in the process.
Well, I know that in the past organizations have reached out to talk to CSKT. And again, I don't want to speak for our elders and folks who back home who have might have concerns. I know there has been some folks who, have concerns about, increased snowmobiling activity and those sorts of things. But we also, for me, I also recognize that, we have bull trout habitat, that is, our bull trout populations continue to struggle, especially as we see rising water temperatures across the state. And, that's critical for me as a Salish and Kootenai person who, has seen our community and our tribes undertake massive efforts to restore bull trout populations. But, we also recognize that there's this balance. A lot of us recognize that there's this balance that, we have to identify ways to work together in order to protect, both fisheries and our wildlife habitat. And I think this bill, it does a good job of bringing folks together in a way that, brings those diverse stakeholders together to talk through these issues and these projects. And so I think it's really important that we remember that this process is collaborative, and that it brings together all these interests that I think at the end of the day care about protecting wildlife habitat and fisheries. I mean, that's one of the criticisms I've heard in the past is, hey, these special interest groups just want to take the reins and ram through their interests on these areas. And I sit there and think, wow, special interest groups that care about conservation, wildlife habitat, fisheries, and protecting and making these areas wilderness in perpetuity. That sounds like a pretty good group of stakeholders to me. And of course, as we look to manage forests, my background is in forestry. I grew up, in a family that logged and also grew up doing my degree in forestry. And of course, as we look to ways to create healthy balances in forests, I think some of the scare tactics I've heard is, in certain areas, people are going to just come in and just clear cut all the trees. And that's not how this works. That's not what we know nowadays as we manage forests, that we're trying to be much smarter about how we manage forests and wild and areas that are wilderness, especially as we take into consideration the needs of our wildlife and fishery population. So, for me, this, there's recreation opportunities that we're finding a really good way of balancing, especially as we look at how we have more populations coming into the state who want to recreate and also want to live here. And so I think this is a great way of protecting those interests that I grew up appreciating and that have been woven into my DNA as a Montanan and as a Native person that lives here and expects to have those experiences forever.
Perfect answer. I also feel like as a Montanan, it feels like some of this happens through kind of osmosis, right? Just being around it. So every time there are kind of threats like this, it's surprising and kind of scary. But Todd, why should folks care about Bcsa if they don't live in the Blackfoot Valley or even Missoula? And what does it mean kind of for conservation as a whole community?
Well, for me, and this is just my perspective, is that every community that I'm part of or have been around in Montana all have these special places that they care very deeply about. And, the fact of the matter is, this is a big one, and it's a big one that everybody in the state, I think, can point to and say, that's a really special place for the whole state. And I think that's a big piece of it, but I also think that once we get through this process and get this done, then we can all turn to our local communities and we can start to take on those projects that we care more deeply about in our own community and in our own backyard. And there are hundreds of those that are in, every community from Eastern Montana all the way, to Superior and St. Regis, that people have these things that they care very deeply about. And I don't think right now we have the bandwidth to just tackle every problem or every challenge or every issue that we want to at the same time. And so by getting this one out of the way, this is the big one to me. This is the big one. that I think anchors the whole process for the rest of the state. So, yeah, I think that's why it has 75% statewide approval. I think people in Billings care as deeply about it as people in Missoula do. And, you know, I think that's an important thing to understand, is that we can all get behind this one so that we can go on to getting behind the things that are in our backyards.
I love that. More momentum for all things conservation. That's great. So I know I mentioned this a little bit during the overview of Bcsa and kind of where things are, but I think that we should talk more about kind of the stagnation in Congress and why it's taken so long for this bill to pass, and why the rest of Montana's federal delegation is not on board. I know that we've gotten a question in from the audience talking about this as well. So it is top of mind. So I will refrain from jumping in first, but I would love for folks to jump in here too.
You know, I can only speak again from my perspective, but I think the thing that gets lost on a lot of us is that collaboration doesn't necessarily mean 100% agreement. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, the best deals, as I like to say, are always the ones where everybody walks away from the table thinking, I should have got a little more than I, you know, like if I'm negotiating for my best interest, I should have got a little more out of it. And I think we've become so polarized that sometimes those little pieces where we don't agree become the things that we focus all of our attention on. And I truly think that if you sat down and really worked through it with Senator Daines, that he would agree on about 90% of it. And it's the 10% that's causing him to sort of back into his corner and put his hackles up and say, I don't want to play that game that way. I'm going to, you know, it's a little political theater and a little, you know, maybe manipulation of the timeline so that maybe we can delay it just a little bit. But I don't think honestly that anybody disagrees on that much of it. And I think for me, that's the frustrating part, is that, you know, we don't have that Mike Mansfield that can stand up and say, look, we don't all agree here, but let's just figure out what we do agree on and let's get this thing done. And I'm hopeful that may happen this go around, but it's gonna be tricky.
Absolutely. Amy or Shane, do you want to jump in here too?
Go ahead, Amy. I'll let you.
Oh, sure. Todd, I love what you said about, collaboration is where it's not 100%. And it's true. I mean, and I also love that each party walks away being like, ooh, it wasn't 100% perfect for me. And my dad used to say that to me growing up, of just like, don't go in expecting this, because that's totally unrealistic. So yeah, I look at it of just how hard people have worked for decades in terms of staying with it. And that comes from really the shared passion of place and the purpose around this. And I look at, how Senator Tester has just like tirelessly, and it just has had like unwavering support of this. And I just ask us all, like, if we can kind of do this harder work of not aligning with, a particular party or an ideology, and just be thinking of this greater good. And I think it really comes down to, what do we want our legacy to be? And do we want it to be one where we allowed ourselves to be divided, or let these opportunities fall by the wayside that we can't ever get back? And that also goes with taking action, and so, our legacy of like this, it doesn't protect itself, and change doesn't these things don't happen on their own. It takes just real commitment of time and energy and focus and resource and moving in the same direction. And so I just hope that the rest of our delegation will really look to what the people want. And the people of Montana have clearly signaled that this is a large priority for us. And that the rest of our delegation just chooses to serve the people of Montana.
Yeah, and thanks, Amy. I would just add on one tidbit, under executive order that the Biden administration has issued, consultation is expected to happen. I would expect it to happen with tribes and expect that those discussions would happen when we look at projects and we look at the stakeholders in the region, especially as projects are undertaken, and we consider possible impacts to resources that could impact treaty rights for the CSKT or other tribes that have Aboriginal territory in the region. So those are things that still exist. I know that some folks collaboration isn't always perfect, but I think at the end of the day, when I think when we look at what has happened in Montana or what efforts have been undertaken to try and get public lands transferred to state ownership to sell off our public lands, when we look at organizations that have tried to infiltrate the state of Montana, efforts that we've been able to block with, I'm sure some of my colleagues who are on this call tonight, Representative Lori Bishop and Representative Connie Keogh, people who worked hand in hand with me in these efforts, to block those special interests. I think this is a great win when we look at what we're actually doing here. We're designating wilderness areas. We're trying to do our best to balance those increased recreational demands and needs in the state of Montana, whether it's snowmobiling or mountain biking or hiking. And I think those are all things that we have to strike a balance on, but also keeping in mind that we are trying to do, everybody in a part of this process does need to consider and will continue to consider the impacts to wildlife and our fisheries. And I think that's expected. And it's something I've seen in working with the organizations like MCV, I've seen take very serious in their work across the state of Montana and in their efforts at the legislature. So I would expect to see a lot of the same, putting our resources over special interest groups that want to come in and buy up our lands and put them into develop them into home sites.
I appreciate that, Shane. And I think it really does kind of boil down to don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? There's so much good that can come out of this. And we're thinking about whatever next generation is coming and making sure that they have wild places to still see and explore. And I think that what is exciting about Bcsa, at least from my standpoint, is it doesn't really block anybody out because there are so many different components. So if you're into snowmobiling, there's a piece for you. If you're into biking, there's a piece for you. If you want to hike, all the things. So I think that there is some really good opportunity. And then of course, like as a hunter and an angler, you're protecting those places so that you have healthy animals that you're able to hunt and everything else. So the habitat component of it is really important. So we have gotten some questions, especially with that 75%, and I'm wondering if there is validity to that and everything else. And so I'd love to hear from the group about what folks in your community or your communities are saying and how they are supporting it and why they're supporting it.
I was going to let someone else go since I just talked for whoever knows how long. I mean, I listen to my constituents and folks I hear, right? And I think, people have, like I try to be open-minded to the concerns that people might have or share, even back home when I've talked to members who recognize and understand that we have treaty rights in the area through the Treaty of Hellgate. And I think the consensus I've always heard from folks is that protecting these areas and designating them and what we're doing far outweighs the concerns that people have heard. And I think that's the beauty and the balance from what I've seen, is that we've taken these things into consideration. We've tried to strike a balance and make it collaborative, where we are still considering the wildlife habitat, any impacts to the resources, to the forests, health, and to the fisheries, and to the water quality as well, right? And I think when you talk about what we're doing and how we've balanced some of these needs and interests that we've seen in Montana, people seem to still be overwhelmingly in support of this effort. That isn't to say that concerns, impacts and noise and people walking through these areas isn't a valid concern, right? I think as we talk about increased hiking or biking or even snowmobile activity, those things definitely matter. And I would say that those folks need to continue to come to the table, because it's a collaborative process, and their voices through the work of the legislation can come forward to be a part of that process as well. And I would encourage them to do so, because those things are valid concerns, and they're valid concerns I've heard from where I come from and where I grew up, and from people that I live in my community. But at the end of the day, I feel like what we've come up with and what the senator has came up with in this legislation really just makes sense, and it gives us assurances that these really important areas will in fact be protected in perpetuity, and will honor and recognize there are treaty rights that encompass this area as well.
Awesome.
And I can speak to that as well in terms of being in dialogue as a member of the Mountain Mamas and connecting with women across the state. And on these topics of clean air, clean water, or climate, and looking for future, not only now, but for future generations. And one of the things that stands out to me and has resonated with a lot of different mamas has been the vulnerability of these waters and lands with a lot of the changes that we're seeing, and in terms of drought, a lot of pressure on fisheries, and so it's looking at with this bill the protection of these tributaries, which are super important because they're cold. The fish can retreat there and ensure future healthy populations. So when you look at this through the lens of climate, these are important actions that need to be taken to protect these places.
Awesome. Thank you.
I just would very quickly add, I just was looking through some of the comments, mm-hmm. and what I see are people who have very specific questions about, almost a subset of people who are part of this whole process, who maybe have some challenges with, the piece of the pie that they didn't walk away from the table with that they really wanted. And that's a hard thing for people to go through and have to sort of manage expectations about what a collaborative process looks like. And my only advice has always been to my employees and everybody, when you're in that situation, is, stay at the table and try to be part of the process. And even if it doesn't feel like it's going the direction it's going, if you're still part of the process, you're still part of the process, and have an opportunity to be heard and to make sure that people understand that what your little perspective is. And then also, be willing to step back from what your little corner of the corral looks like and recognize that there's a whole lot more there. And, I think in our world we live in right now, politically, people tend to want to go to the corner right away and put the fence up and stand behind it. And, I mean, the world without this is not a positive thing in my mind, when I look at the big picture. And, that's just how I see it. And that's my personal view. And I know most of my customers, there are bikers who wish there was more biking. And there's, I think as a river person myself, I'm like Shane, I'm most strongly concerned about trying to make sure that we protect those areas that are the headwaters of this river, because if we lose those, then it's game over, and we're going to have, no reason to float the Blackfoot except to, put our feet outside of an inner tube and relax on a hot sunny day. And I hope that's not what happens. So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I guess the larger question that's kind of driving this whole panel is, what can Montanans do to support Bcsa right now? Do you have good advice for folks? I know for the MCV Education Fund, we do have a petition to encourage Senator Daines to support the bill. And we encourage everybody to sign it. We've already got hundreds of folks already signed on. So the more people, that really does matter. It will make a difference. So I encourage everybody to do that. And we will be dropping the link into the chat for the petition. So keep your eyes on that. But other folks, if there are other things that you would recommend to everyday Montanans who are out there.
Sure. I would love to just make a pitch to, in addition to the what MCV Education Fund is putting forward, to also go to the Mama's website, and I can drop the link in the chat. But if you go to the click take action section for the Bcsa, and there's a little part where you can make your voice heard and fill out the form to let Senator Daines know that we really need his support to pass this legislation. So I'll drop that link in, and we'd love for you to take a look at the other initiatives that we're working on in Montana as well.
I would just say for myself, this is a conversation that happens on chairlifts and over coffee and, on the trail when you meet people, and just talking to people and finding out, what they're thinking and where they're at. And I'm always the person that says that, all politics are local and they're done one-to-one. I mean, the only effective way I've ever changed anybody's mind or had my mind changed was to sit down with somebody and to hear them out and to find out what their perspective is and to try to give them my perspective. And I think that's where we're at. We're still in a place like Montana where, your voice as an individual matters, and your ears matter a lot, where you can learn a lot from people. And I think I just encourage people to just continue to stay involved and ask your friends those questions. And, I think I said earlier, my wife is from Phillipsburg, and, I've had a number of really good conversations with people who, we don't agree on a lot of things, but a lot of the things that we agree on are in the meat of this bill. And I think that's a really important thing to agree on. And we can disagree on the stuff we disagree on and still be friends. But I think that, we need to get back to that in our world. And I think it has to happen mano a mano. So
100%.
I love that. Yeah, I agree on having more conversations, and in those conversations, a lot of it is the listening component. And so it's not just taking turns talking, but the listening component to say like, oh wait, what does your part of the corral look like? And I don't know actually what that's not my lived experience. How here, this is actually an amazing opportunity to find out, a story that may go back many, many, many generations, and is totally different than, my personal story is I came here 16 years ago and fell head over heels for Missoula and from Montana just for stopping from a cup of coffee. And that's not an unlikely story, or that's not an unusual story. That's one that many of us share. But my story is relatively short, I only have a certain lived experience. And so this opportunity to really have these discussions and dialogues about what we love, and a lot of those things we can agree on, and where we think more work can be done, and also just a bit of a perspective that it's hard for one solution to solve every problem.
I believe there is a senior senator that says we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So that goes along with kind of everything that we've all said here too, is I think that the listening component is so important. And I think that the other pieces, of course, that we've talked about is kind of that shared value. So before we open it up for further questions, I think it's like everybody's story is really important. So if there is a recreational story that you have in the Blackfoot Valley, what's your favorite memory? What is that? Also, we'd love for folks to add that to the chat, but for our panelists, I'd love to ask that question to you as well.
Well, one of my most memorable moments, especially being in the Bob Marshall area, was, camping, fighting fire and being out in the wilderness, camping for weeks with some of my closest friends, and eating Spam out in the middle of the wilderness area while we put out fires, right? And I think as you start to learn more about, the health of ecosystems in Montana and the importance of fire and how fire suppression is, contributed some of that over the years, you start to learn, our efforts are actually part of the problem in some of those instances, which is crazy to think about, but now a necessary thing because of how hot fires burn now with our fire suppression efforts over the last, decades or the last 100+ years, right? So for me, it was just moments being out there in the wilderness and just appreciating that and being with friends and family and, eating huckleberries and trying to hike out of the wilderness before dark time and feeling lost out in the middle of nowhere. But, I would just I think Todd, earlier, your point to the last question was on point. I think, I'm seeing the comments and I think, we're individuals who care about the legislation and I feel it's fairly balanced in the way it was approached. I definitely want people to know that I don't think, or I believe that our opinions matter. And I think that even if they feel that their opinions haven't been taken into consideration, they need to continue to advocate for their perspectives and ensuring that they are coming to the table to bring science forward for decisions that will be made in the future. I think the work is far from done. And that's why this is such a beautiful process, is because it is collaborative and it's continuous, right? And so it'll need those folks and all their opinions will need they'll need to continue to bring those forward. And I think they should as well. So I think that's important. And I think that's a great way to balance things in Montana.
Absolutely. And I'll just jump in here and just say that one of the questions was how folks can create better teamwork and other organizations can get involved and everything else. And we're going to drop in our Bcsa coalition website. And we really encourage folks to check that out. Be in touch with us. We definitely want to hear from you. And so that is one way to get involved and kind of go through that funnel. But if there's other folks that would like to jump in here, that's great. Alrighty. So one of the other questions that we have gotten, are there things you'd like to see Montana State Parks and Recreation Board do, not do, pay more attention to? Are there things that like our state government could be doing to help push this forward? I'll jump in here and just say any kind of pressure from any kind of point is very helpful. So if we've got people standing up and making their voices heard, regardless if they are private citizens or they are elected officials or they are a part of the Parks Commission, I think that that is an open opportunity for everybody. That is the best part of all of this. I think that we sometimes forget that our folks that we elect, regardless if it's in state or out in the federal area in DC, they work for us. We're ultimately the boss. So the more that we are communicating, the more our voices are heard, and the more we definitely can work together as a community.
Absolutely. Whitney, I think that's a good point. I think, when I was an undergrad, I had the opportunity to work on a comprehensive plan in the Swan, and that was a really fun process in looking at going and researching, especially the CSKT's treaty rights and work in the area. So that was another special memory I had, and being a part of that, even though briefly it was important. But I think in Montana, voicing your opinion to legislators obviously matters. I think for us, my experience has been that, I want to protect our public lands from being sold off. That's still a true threat and reality in the world that we live in. And oftentimes, the people that should be coming together to work together, to collaborate, can, make that process worse. And so I think we as legislators try to do our best to work with our constituents and be a voice for them. But when we're talking about Congress and we're talking about, Senator Tester in Congress, your voice matters, because, we can tell them what we're hearing from folks, but at the end of the day, they do want to hear from you. I want to hear from folks when we make decisions on our public lands in the state of Montana, which is one thing I love about the community I live in, is folks are engaged, paying attention, and they're advocating. And by far, I hear way more support for this project than I do opposition. And it's been probably more than 75% of the people that talk to me about this are for the most part supportive of this project, or of this particular project, or this legislation, I should say.
And I can add to that as well in terms of, I remember first starting to advocate about issues that I cared about and thinking that, a single voice is a drop in the bucket, and what does it really matter? And then to talk to various elected officials at various levels, and seeing like, no, it really does matter. Like, calls are listened to, letters are read, op-eds are paid attention to, letters to the LTEs, letters to the editor. There's just a lot of different ways that you can take action. Put a yard sign supporting this up in your yard for visual support. And so it's a combination of like all these different ways, and that really gives elected officials a pulse of how deep this support is, and that it is pretty broad and pretty deep. So I would, really, advocacy is way more fun than I thought it would be. And I think that initially, because of being so passionate about the issues, I was like, oh, this is going to be so hard. And it's like, no, it's great. It's being like, hey, like, this is what I love, and here's why I love it, and here's what's keeping me up at night, and what are you thinking about this? And just realizing that it actually helped in talking with someone who had recently moved here from California, who reminded me of this level of access to not only our public lands, but also in waters, our elected officials is also unprecedented. So, it's coming, he was someone from California that was like, no, it really does feel like, it's not even a bucket that my voice is a drop in, it's like, but being like in Montana, this is very real connection. And so it is really important to show up and keep showing up.
Awesome. Well, we are coming to the final minutes of our time. So I would love to give everybody on the panel one last opportunity to say something before we wrap up. If folks want to say anything or not, that's fine too.
I just want to say thank you to you, Whitney, for hosting this, and the MCV Education Fund and all your work on it, to everyone who has been part of this coalition, who has worked so hard to move this forward, to everyone on the call for showing up and caring about this. And I really look forward to celebrating when this thing crosses the finish line. It's going to be a great day.
Awesome.
Yeah, I would just echo that as well. That for me, I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk about it, and it's always intriguing to me, and I learn a lot by reading the comments and understanding where people are at. And my motto to my staff has always been that the world is run by the people that show up to run it, and when you find something that you're terribly passionate about, it's your job to take that passion and run with it however you can. And we all approach it from a slightly different point of view. And a lot of the things that people are talking about, I don't have a deep amount of knowledge of, but it's great information for me to go research and find some more things out. And I just, at the end of the day, when I sit down and look at this, and when I sat down 10 years ago and first got involved, is that are we in a better place with it or without it? Mm-hmm. And I really think that we're in a better place with it. It's not perfect. There's no question that people are going to find things they don't like, but at the end of the day, we're better with it than we are without it. And that's my opinion. So I'll close with that.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think, I echo what Todd has to say. I think that's where I land at the end of the day, as a Montanan and a person who hunts a lot and, recreates a ton in Montana. It's woven into my DNA as a person and as a Montanan. And I think this for me is a big deal. I just want to say thank you to MCV and Senator Tester for all of your work on this front. It's critical. And I think this is, Montana, we do things different. And I think this is one of those examples of how we can bring diverse stakeholders to the table, and we can protect wilderness areas and bring people to the table to work together to hash it all out. And so I think for me, I think the rest of the country is going to be watching, and they're going to see how Montana does things different, and we do it our way, and we do it in a way where it balances interest, but also protects the resources at the same time.
Great. So in the Montana way, we encourage everybody to go to our website and sign on to this petition to Senator Daines to encourage him to sign on to the legislation. We would love for this to be a bipartisan love fest coming from Montana. And, we will continue to update our supporters on the progress of Bcsa in DC. And we encourage everybody to get involved. It's also worth mentioning because we have an audience right now. We are putting on MCV's annual celebration in Helena on March 4th. This is our sister organization's big fundraiser for the year. Tickets are live now, and we hope that everybody will join us at the Holter. And so you can follow the link there. And of course, we're doing what we can, and we really hope that we can get your support as we dive into this, but then also lots of other issues as well. So I really, really am grateful for our panelists tonight. I know that we're a couple of minutes over, so appreciate your time. I know that time is precious right now, and we can't wait until we can do something like this in person, because I think that will be even more exciting to fire people up to protect this place that is so special and so unique. So thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great evening. Bye.